The Cold Man is a creepy story about someone that has a strange dream where they meet a childhood friend who offers them some chilling advice. I had a strange dream last night. It was the kind of dream that seems all too real, right up until the point where you wake up in a cold sweat. Last night, when I was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, an uneasy feeling came over me. It was almost as if I was being watched. But more than that, I felt like there was someone in the room with me. As disturbing as the feeling was, I still couldn't keep myself from falling asleep. I don't recall how the dream began exactly, but the first thing I remember was walking out of my house. All of my neighbors' houses were gone, and I found myself on a long, empty road. It was cold and dark, and there was nobody else around. I felt like I was completely lost and alone, but I wasn't afraid. I don't know how long I was on that road. It felt like I was walking endlessly. Eventually, I reached a fork in the road, and when I stopped, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. A voice called out to me from the side of the road. "I'm sorry to see you here," the voice whispered, "but it's good to see you." I recognized the voice. It was an old friend from my childhood. Someone I hadn't seen in years. He looked a little different from how I remembered him. Even though we were both the same age, he seemed much younger than me somehow. He was also very pale and had dark circles around his eyes. His lips were blue. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "I'm here to warn you," he replied. "There's a man in your house." "What do you mean?" I said, puzzled. "I was just there." "You don't understand," replied my friend with apparent urgency. "He's in your house right now." I had no idea what he was talking about, but I was curious. "Who?" I asked. "The Cold Man," he replied. "He comes to people at night when they're afraid. He waits to be noticed, then he makes his move. You know that chill you feel on your back when something really scares you? That's him standing behind you." "What does he do once you notice him?" I asked. My friend looked down. "Just don't let him in," he cautioned. "What do you mean?" "He can be close forever," my friend explained. "He'll walk around your house at night and even stand in your room while you're asleep, like he is in yours right now. He can know where you are. He can even be looking right at you, but he won't find you unless you let him." "How does he find you?" "I mean, how do you let him?" My friend glanced over his shoulder furtively, as if he was worried someone might overhear. Leaning in close, he whispered in my ear, "If you see him, if you hear him, or if you suddenly start to feel suddenly very cold, don't move. Don't talk to him. Don't acknowledge him. Don't ever let him in." "I don't understand," I pleaded. "How do I get rid of him?" "You can't," my friend replied sadly. "Look, I'm already out of time." "Out of time?" I repeated, not sure what he meant exactly. My friend just shook his head. His eyes were wide and he was shivering. Just then, I noticed a dark figure creeping from the shadows. "My time is up," said my friend. "Whatever you do, just don't let him in. Don't answer it." Before I could ask anything more, my friend was enveloped by the shadows and something seemed to pull him into the darkness. I couldn't see him anymore. I was about to run after him when I was awakened by a loud noise. When I opened my eyes, I found myself sitting upright in my bedroom, fully dressed. I could have sworn I wasn't dressed when I went to bed. My shoes were covered in a thin film of dust and my feet were sore. I felt so cold. I heard a ringing noise, and when I looked down, I saw that I was holding my phone. I was about to answer it when I remembered my friend's words in the dream. I didn't answer it. Eventually, it stopped ringing. I rubbed my hands together. The room was as cold as ice. The feeling that I was being watched was as strong as it had ever been. I could hear something moving inside my closet, but I didn't dare to move. I just closed my eyes and waited. Eventually, I heard footsteps inside my closet. They grew more and more faint, as if walking away down some unseen hallway. When the footsteps finally stopped, the coldness dissipated and the room returned to normal. He didn't get in this time. If my friend in the dream was telling the truth, if the thing in my closet was who I think it was, I must never let him in. I know he'll be back. I don't know what happened to my friend, but I just hope people will remember his warning. If you start to feel cold while reading this, don't be alarmed. If you hear something in your house, just ignore it. You can't afford to let him find you. Don't let the cold man in. The Digital Camera is a scary ghost story about a little girl whose mother dies suddenly. She begins to exhibit strange behavior and refuses to be left alone. It is based on a supposedly true story that apparently happened in Japan a few years ago. One of my relatives passed away suddenly. I never met the woman. She had a daughter who was 4 years old. The little girl's name was Yuki. Her father wasn't able to raise her on his own, so he asked my aunt to take care of her. The little girl refused to be left alone and never left my aunt's side. It started to become a problem. My aunt couldn't go anywhere without Yuki. She constantly needed attention. Even my aunt's own daughter started to get jealous. One day, my aunt told me she had to go out of town for a couple of days and asked if I would babysit the little girl for her. I said it would be my pleasure. I lived alone and I could do with some company. A few days later, my aunt dropped Yuki off at my apartment. As she was leaving, she took the little girl aside and said, "Yuki, please be good. Behave yourself." When my aunt was gone, I tried to talk to Yuki and play some games with her, but the little girl's behavior was very strange. She had a teddy bear tucked tightly under her arm and never let go of it. She never smiled. She never spoke. All she ever did was sit quietly in the corner and stare at the wall. It made me kind of uneasy. I was trying to find something that would entertain her. I had just bought a new digital camera and I decided to let Yuki play with my old one. When she saw the camera, her eyes lit up. I showed her how to use it and she went around my apartment taking pictures of everything. There was a bright smile on her face. That evening, I discovered how difficult Yuki was to deal with. Whenever I tried to leave the room, she started crying and screaming out my name. I couldn't leave her alone or she would create a huge fuss. She even insisted on going to the bathroom with me, which was very embarrassing. At bedtime, she refused to stay in the spare room and insisted on sleeping in my bed. I read her a bedtime story and after a while, I managed to get her to go to sleep. That was when I noticed her teddy bear. One of its legs was charred and blackened, as if it had been burned. It made me wonder. In the middle of the night, I was awoken by a strange noise. When I turned over, I saw that there was something wrong with Yuki. The little girl's body was trembling and shaking. Her eyes were wide open, her teeth were chattering, and tears were streaming down her cheeks. I held her close and asked her what was wrong. "She's looking at me again," she mumbled. "Who is?" I asked in surprise. "The dark woman," replied Yuki. She wouldn't say anything more. I tried to tell her it was just her imagination, but she kept shaking her head and whimpering. It took me a long time to get her to go back to sleep. The next day, Yuki was fine again. She loved playing with my digital camera. When it was time for her to go home, I told her she could keep it. Yuki hugged me. Although she didn't say anything, I could tell she was overjoyed. I dropped the little girl off at my aunt's house and stayed to have a cup of tea. My aunt thanked me for taking care of Yuki. We spent a while chatting at the kitchen table. "Poor little thing," said my aunt. "She hasn't said a word since her mother died." I couldn't contain my curiosity. "How did Yuki's mom die?" I asked. A strange look came over my aunt's face. "She died in a fire." "How did the fire start?" I asked. "Well," my aunt hesitated, unwilling to talk about it. "It's a very sad story. She committed suicide. Yuki's mother was a very troubled woman. She poured gasoline over herself and lit a match. She burned herself alive." "OMG!" I exclaimed. "How horrible!" "Yes," said my aunt. "Her family was so shocked, they hushed it up and pretended it was an accident. We had a small funeral, but only close relatives were invited. Yuki wasn't there. She doesn't even know her mother is dead. She thinks her mother is just on a long holiday. We haven't had the heart to tell her the truth." "Poor Yuki," I murmured. My aunt nodded her head sadly. "Poor Yuki." A few days after that, Yuki died. My aunt was trying to change Yuki's behavior. At night, she forced the little girl to sleep in her own bedroom. Even though Yuki screamed and cried, my aunt left her there alone and locked the door. In the morning, she found Yuki lying motionless in bed. The poor little girl was dead. Nobody could understand what had happened. The coroner couldn't determine a cause of death. There wasn't a mark on her body. She was perfectly healthy. She had just mysteriously died during the night. There was no explanation. After the funeral, I went back to my aunt's house. Everyone was very sad. She returned the digital camera I had given to Yuki. I took it home with me. It was something to remember her by. The memory card was full of random photos that Yuki had taken. I browsed through them, wiping a tear from my eye. There were pictures of my apartment, pictures of my aunt's house, pictures of flowers, dogs, toys, silly pictures that a child would take. Then, I came to the last picture and it made my blood run cold. My hands were trembling. I wanted to scream, but nothing would come out. The timestamp on the photo showed that it had been taken on the night Yuki died. This happened a few months ago, when I was in my second year of junior high school. Hanging on the wall, at the back of our classroom, there was a suggestion box. It was put there by the teacher, Mrs. Solomon. If any students had ideas for improvements that could be made, we were supposed to write our opinions down in a letter and put it in a suggestion box. Then, Mrs. Solomon would read the letters and consider our proposals. One morning, when we came to class, someone had crossed out the suggestion part of the sign and written death there instead. The death box caused a bit of a stir in the classroom. Some students thought it was funny, but others were a little disturbed by it. There were rumors that two boys named Derek and Jamal did it as a prank. They were always causing mischief and disrupting class. However, when the teacher confronted them about it, both of them denied it. Afterwards, I quietly asked them if they really had done it. They still claimed they knew nothing about it. In the end, the teacher couldn't figure out who the culprit was and the matter was dropped. A few days later, Derek was found hanging by the neck in the classroom after school. He was dead. There was a note in the death box that read, "Sorry for annoying everyone in the class." A few days after Derek's funeral, Jamal was also found hanging by the neck in the classroom. In the death box, there was another note that read, "Sorry for annoying everyone in the class." We were all shocked. None of us could understand why two of our classmates would suddenly commit suicide. It was very disturbing. After that, when we came to school, the classroom seemed very creepy. All we could think about was what had occurred there. Soon after that, I transferred to a new school. I had to get used to the new classroom and trying to make a new group of friends. One day, when I got home after school and turned on the TV, I saw a breaking news report. It was about my previous school. Scrolling across the bottom of the screen, I saw the headline, "Teacher Suicide." The news anchor was saying the teacher who committed suicide was the homeroom teacher of the two boys who were killed. She left behind a suicide note that read, "I always wanted to know what it would feel like to kill. Sorry for all the fuss." I stared at the screen in disbelief. According to the news report, Derek and Jamal had not committed suicide after all. They were murdered by our teacher, Mrs. Solomon. And then she committed suicide. It was all too much to take in, and very hard to believe. Sure, sometimes Mrs. Solomon would scold the students for misbehaving, but she was usually a kind and gentle woman. Why would she do all this? I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I had misbehaved just as much as Derek or Jamal. If I had not been transferred to a different school, perhaps I would have been next. Just then, I heard the sound of the front door opening. My mother was home from work. She came into the room carrying an envelope in her hand. "There was a letter for you," she said. "Why are you so pale? You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't answer her. Instead, I took the letter and examined it. The envelope was blank. There was no address written on it. I opened it and found a note inside, written in big, red letters. It read, "Don't think you can escape." 15 days have passed since then, but I'm still afraid to set foot outside my front door. The Broken Window is a scary story about a mother who takes her daughter for a drive. When the car breaks down on a lonely mountain road, they have a horrifying encounter. It is based on a Japanese story. A week ago, I was driving home and my young daughter was in the car with me. I was in a hurry, so I decided to take a shortcut that led us down a lonely mountain road. All of a sudden, In the middle of nowhere, the engine started to splutter and the car ground to a halt. When I took out my mobile phone, I realized that I had no signal. We were completely stranded, deep in the mountains. I had no idea how to fix the car, and it was growing dark. There was no gas station for miles, and the road was not used very often. It was clear that we would have to spend the night in the car and hope that some passing motorist would stop and give us a ride. The sun was going down, and it was beginning to get very cold. An eerie silence descended over the mountain, and all I could hear was the wind rustling through the trees. My daughter went to sleep in the passenger seat. I closed my eyes and was starting to drift off as well when I heard a strange noise. It sounded like a voice. I couldn't make out what it was saying. It sounded like gibberish. Tensametsu. 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 At first, I thought I was dreaming, but as it got closer and closer, I opened my eyes and looked around. Tensametsu. 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 A dark figure was approaching the car. All I could see was a silhouette. It looked like a man, and he seemed to be dragging his foot. Tensametsu. 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 I looked down at my daughter. She was still asleep. I didn't want to wake her up. All of a sudden, the noise stopped. The eerie silence returned. Then, I looked up and got the fright of my life. I had to stop myself from screaming out loud. Standing at the passenger window was the most hideous figure I have ever seen. It looked like a man, but his face was so twisted and contorted that it formed a frightening visage. He was horribly deformed. It was as if every piece of skin on his face had been peeled off, and all that was left was bloody red muscle and sinew. He had no nose. He had no ears. His piercing eyes stared at me through the glass. I turned the key in the ignition again and again and tried to start the car, but it was no use. The engine just chugged and died. Outside the window, the hideous man took out a knife. He began chanting over and over to himself. Tensametsu. 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 Suddenly, there was a loud crash and the passenger window shattered. Broken glass showered all over my daughter. I screamed hysterically. The man's arm came through the window and he brandished the knife, lashing out at me. Tensametsu. 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 Just then, I turned the key one last time and the engine sprang to life. I floored the accelerator and the car tore out of there like a bat out of hell. I sped off down the narrow mountain road, leaving the hideous man far behind. I didn't know where we were going. I just kept driving and driving, never daring to look back. That's when I noticed my daughter hadn't moved. When I looked down at her, I could see she was muttering something to herself. Tensametsu. 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 A chill ran down my spine. Her face was pale and she was trembling. I shook her, trying to wake her up, but when she opened my eyes, what I saw horrified me. Her eyes were rolled back in her head. All I could see were the whites of her eyes. Her teeth were gritted together and she was foaming at the mouth. Her face had changed. She didn't even look like my daughter anymore. She just kept growling over and over, Tensametsu. 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 I kept driving and finally I saw the city lights up ahead. We came to a church and I pulled over to the side of the road. Scooping my daughter up in both arms, I carried her into the church and started screaming for help. An old priest appeared from a doorway and asked what was wrong. I told him about the thing I had encountered on the mountain road. He took one look at my daughter, then snatched her from my arms and laid her out on the church altar. As I watched, crying and shaking with fear, he took out some rosary beads and held the little wooden cross to my daughter's forehead. Then, he started reciting prayers in Latin. The priest let us stay there for the night. He put my daughter in a spare bed and stayed up with her all night long, holding her hand, anointing her with holy water and reciting prayers over her. He placed a Bible on her chest and a scapula around her neck. He told me my daughter was possessed by a demon and he had to try to perform an exorcism. He said that if it was not done and my daughter stayed like this for 49 days, she would never recover. She would be left permanently insane. The priest instructed me to leave my daughter with him so that he could perform the necessary rituals. He said that if I stayed, there was a good chance the demon could possess me as well. It has been a week since my daughter was possessed, and the priest is still taking care of her. I check on her every day. It's like she isn't even my daughter anymore. She smirks and looks at me with indescribably horrible eyes. I just want my daughter back. If you ever find yourself on a lonely mountain road, whatever you do, don't stop. The Black Cross is a creepy story about a group of friends who ditch school and go to check out a mysterious abandoned house nearby. A few weeks ago, some friends of mine from school died suddenly. Some others went insane. The doctors tried to pass it all off as mental illness, but I know the truth. They were possessed by something. When I was in school, I used to hang around with a group of boys in my class. There were 5 of us all together: Danny, Mitch, Eric, Hugh, and myself. We never paid much attention to our schoolwork and spent our time ditching class and getting up to mischief. The teachers hardly even noticed our absence, and our parents never suspected a thing. One day, Danny and Mitch told the rest of us about a creepy urban legend they heard regarding a house that was near our school. The father of the family had gone insane and hung himself. When his wife and kids discovered the body, they were so traumatized that they couldn't stay in the home again. They abandoned the house, and it had lain vacant ever since. We were so curious that we immediately decided to check it out. The next day, we all snuck out of school after lunch and went to the house. When we got there, we were surprised to find that it was just a normal-looking home. You would never have suspected that someone had committed suicide in the place. Danny and Mitch went in first, and the rest of us followed close behind. We went into the kitchen first and rummaged through the drawers and cupboards to see what was inside. There was nothing much of interest. Going upstairs, we explored the bedrooms, but most of the furniture had been removed. Just then, Eric noticed something in the hallway. There were 2 small windows at the very end. They were high up, almost touching the ceiling. It seemed strange because there was another room behind the windows, but no door to access it. Standing on each other's shoulders, we opened one of the windows and all of us managed to climb through. There was a musty smell in the air. It stank of damp and dry rot. The moldy wallpaper was peeling off the walls. It was empty except for a desk in the corner with a black box sitting on top of it. On the wall above it hung a large wooden cross. The strange thing was that the desk, the box, and the cross had all been painted completely black. "I've got a bad feeling about this," said Danny, as he walked over to the desk and examined the box. Mitch was picking at the wallpaper. "This place gives me the creeps," he said with a grimace. Danny flicked the latch on the black box, opened the lid, and looked inside. "I wonder what this is," he exclaimed. Just then, I happened to glance down at the floor. There was something carved into the wooden floorboards. It was some sort of symbol that covered the entire floor. A 5-pointed star with a circle around it. I recognized that symbol. It was a pentagram. Mitch pulled a long, sticky sheet of wallpaper off the wall. As he did so, it crumpled to the ground, revealing what was behind it. Underneath the paper, the wall was covered with inverted black crosses. Danny lifted something shiny out of the box. It was a small, golden chalice. "There's something in it," he croaked. "Some red liquid. I think it's blood." At that exact moment, the black cross above the desk burst into flames. Everybody froze. We all started to freak out. Danny turned as white as a ghost. He was still holding the chalice in his trembling hands. His eyes rolled back in his head, and his tongue hung out of his mouth as if he was choking. Mitch started screaming in terror. He began climbing up the wall and crawled out of the window. I was right behind him, hoisting myself up and throwing myself through the narrow opening. I fell into the hallway on the other side, almost landing on top of Mitch. He managed to clamber out through the window as well, his eyes wide with fear. I could hear Danny's voice screeching on the other side of the wall. Eric appeared at the window. He was clutching onto the ledge with one hand, while his other arm flailed wildly. "My leg!" he cried. "He's got my leg!" I grabbed his arm and tried to pull him through. We could hear Danny in the room, moaning and howling like a dog. Eric was in a blind panic, struggling and screaming for help. "My leg! My leg!" he kept screeching. We all pulled as hard as we could. Eric came tumbling out through the window, and we all fell in a heap on the floor. He was shaking, crying, and whimpering. I looked down at his leg and was horrified to find that there was a huge chunk missing from his calf. The flesh had been torn away from the bone. "He bit me," Eric wailed pitifully. "Call an ambulance," I shouted. Hugh scrambled to his feet, ran to get help. Danny continued yelling and screaming in the other room. We were too scared to peer in the window and check on him. We all exchanged frightened looks. "I think he's possessed," said Mitch. We sat there on the dusty floor and waited, listening to the tortured screams of Danny. He was like a wild animal, charging around like a crazed beast. He was uncontrollable, screaming, crying, and bouncing around the room. Eventually, an ambulance arrived and the paramedics attended to Eric's wounds. The police came too, and when they saw the crazed state that Danny was in, they called for backup. The ambulance took Eric to the hospital. Our names and addresses were taken, and we were driven home by 2 officers. We never saw Danny again. There was a rumor at school that his parents had to put him in a mental hospital. The police came and talked to our parents many times after that, but they never told us what they were discussing. Of course, we were all grounded for the rest of the year. In school, we were on our best behavior, not wanting to get into any more trouble. One day, I was called to the principal's office. When I opened the door, I was shocked to see Mitch and Hugh sitting in front of the principal's desk. Their faces were ashen. As soon as I closed the door behind me, the principal began speaking. "Eric is dead," he announced. I couldn't believe it. Then, I realized I hadn't seen Eric for days. I thought he was just absent from school. It turned out that he had collapsed and died of a heart attack. He was only 14 years old. The doctors couldn't explain it. Nobody could. Mitch, Hugh, and myself left the office that day with a heavy feeling in our hearts. We were the last surviving members of our group. We didn't speak to each other. There was nothing to say. The haunted expressions on our faces spoke volumes. After that, we all sort of drifted apart. During the summer holidays, I happened to run into Mitch's sister at the mall. As soon as she set eyes on me, she broke down in tears. She told me that Mitch was dead and Hugh had gone insane. Mitch hung himself in his bedroom. He told his parents he was going to bed and locked the door. He was found with his head shaved. His hair had been glued, piece by piece, to the ceiling. His eyes and mouth had been sewn shut with a needle and thread. Hugh was found crawling down the street naked. He was laughing hysterically and grinning like a maniac. He couldn't close his eyes. When paramedics sedated him and brought him to hospital, they discovered he had cut off his own eyelids. At that moment, I knew that we were all cursed and now, I was the only one left. A few days later, I was struck down by a mysterious illness. I had a fever and was confined to bed. All I could do was lie there. I couldn't eat or drink anything. It felt as if something was squeezing my chest and crushing me, trying to turn me inside out. I was sure I was at death's door. The whites of my eyes turned black. I was in so much pain that I didn't care if I lived or died. I just wanted it to be over. One night, Danny came to me in a dream. He had withered away to nothing. All that was left was skin and bones. His skin was charred and blackened, and his eyes were completely white. "You're the last one," he whispered. "Yeah," I replied. "The only one who remembers what happened on that day," he said. "I know," I replied. "You should come here," he said. "You belong with us." "Where are you?" I asked nervously. "You know where we are," he chuckled. "We're in hell."